Auntie Beeb is at it again, giving airtime to climate change denial and obscuration. Let's take a look. We join Agnes Poirier on Dateline London.
And it's also a time for, I think, every one of us. You know, we can have individually massive impact on the reduction of of carbon emissions, which is at the beginning of which is the root of the problem.
Individuals can do what they can, but there's a bigger picture, and it's industry, and it's airspace, and nations have all got to be acting in concert to have any substantial difference.
That's why we had an agreement, and that's why, for instance, public transport, you know, I mean, the Americans must start hopping on trains rather than on planes. It already happens in Europe, but just imagine if Europeans who hop on planes for 1 hour or 2 hour journeys started taking trains, it would have actually a massive impact. Same with cars. So, you know, it's very well in Europe we say, oh yes, but the Chinese or the Americans are the biggest polluters. Well, you know, it starts at home.
Mar-a-Lago is in the eye of is part of the mandatory evacuation area, isn't it? One wonders whether would that have an impact?
On Donald Trump.
I mean, obviously on Donald Trump and his approach to climate change.
Will it?
Do you think, John?
I risk unpopularity in saying this, but I think that the instinct to go after Trump, whatever happens, whatever the issue may be, in this case might be a little bit
I don't think anyone's blaming him personally for these rising sea temperatures and the hurricanes that have resulted, but in terms of his language around the issue.
I think you could say that Trump is not a total outlier in espousing some of the more sceptical views on the climate change issue. And I would not have thought that these storms will settle that debate conclusively once and for all. There is a debate to be had. It does look more and more likely that there is a connection, but it's as yet unproven, I would say, at least unproven for a significant and respectable body of scientific opinion in the US and elsewhere. But mainly I just feel uncomfortable with the idea that we've got a new opportunity to kick Trump. It seems to me there are much bigger issues in this than Trump.
Why is the BBC still giving space to John Fisher-Burns' dishonest drivel on climate change? There is no debate. The science is in, climate change is here, and it is making bad weather worse. For the record, Hurricane Irma had the second strongest winds in recorded history, and spending 3 days as a Category 5 storm is unprecedented since scientists first began using satellites to track weather. Let's continue. Host Jane Hill does mention meteorologists, but Burns is not rebuffed, and instead, no expert, Diane Wei-Lin, chips in.
Every meteorologist I've interviewed this week has made the point that temperatures are rising, and crucially sea temperatures are rising, and that is why fundamentally you get far, far, far more rainfall with these than you've had before. And in many countries and many of the islands that have been so badly affected, it's just the sheer intensity of rainfall, isn't it, in such a short space of time. That's what causes the devastation. I mean, some Caribbean islands completely wiped out.
And I mean, I'm no expert, and I've probably read similar things that you've interviewed people on, and the experts have said the reason that these storms are stronger than before is because the sea temperatures are about half a point or to 1.5 degrees higher than usual. Therefore, it allows the storm to become stronger and to become these sort of Category 5, and as they form and go through the ocean. I think it's very good sort of point to start the debate and to look back to the Paris Agreement and to look at climate change. And it's not conclusive. One hurricane does not change the fact that we have a weather system, but it is the time that we should look at it. And the experts have said this is caused by climate change. I'm no expert.
But we need to go back long before the Paris Climate Change Agreement and look at the hurricanes in the early years of the 20th century, which were not as devastating, were yet pretty devastating, long before climate change, man-made climate change became an issue, to try and understand this.
Burns butts in with an irrelevancy. Why do we need to look at hurricanes in the early part of the 20th century? To muddy the waters, presumably. Would that Burns had the honesty to call himself a no expert. Now comes the turn of Steve Richards to ramble on.
But you see, I think the reason why it is of political significance is not an instinct just to bash Trump, but if you stand back and look at the challenges a new president or leader could face, this really challenges him in the same way, in a way that Grenfell Tower challenged Theresa May in the immediate aftermath of the election, because it raised so many questions about housing. The fire that killed 80 people in London, because it raised questions about housing, regulation, and issues that went deep into the philosophy of her governing party. For these hurricanes to erupt with a president who doesn't believe in climate change and doesn't really believe in active government, this is a massive challenge, because if you believe in it as a leader, at least you have a navigating principle that this is a challenge, a fundamental challenge, and the cause is something partly man-made that we have to address. If you haven't, so for example, when there were winter floods in the UK of sort of apocalyptic scale, David Cameron was then Prime Minister, he said, I believe the cause of this is climate change. Now, once you've done that, you begin to have a set of possible routes through. As a president, if you don't believe in that, you are sort of operating wildly in a kind of vacuum. And also, if you don't believe in big, active government, which has to mediate between these huge eruptions, you really are struggling to offer the kind of authority and leadership
and it's
in
also
response
about
to this.
planning, because you know, then the issue for Trump, the issue is only about flood relief. You know, let's help the victim, of course, but then what about the cause? And we must stop building in flood areas and flood zones, for instance. You know, we must adapt and change our habits, and we must plan for the future, basically.
You know, a large part of the debate on the part of those who are sceptical about the Paris Agreement has not so much to do with the science as it has to do with an agreement which is seen as being fundamentally unbalanced, which allows India and China, which are on their way to becoming the world's greatest polluters, to continue to pollute at a much greater, by a very large factor, than the developed countries, on a basis of historical fairness. And I think there are a lot of people in the United States who feel, with Trump, that unfairness needs to be rectified if there is to be a sustainable treaty.
So, after suggesting that there is a scientific debate about climate change, Burns backtracks and says the real reason for climate change scepticism is that it is unfair to the US. Newsflash! The US has currently less than 5% of the world's population, but emits 15% of the world's greenhouse gases. In the past 200 years, no country has polluted the earth more than the US, and being one of the most affluent developed countries in the world, the US has no excuse that it needs to pollute to bring its citizens out of poverty. But then the Paris Climate Change Agreement is a joke. Countries are left to set their own targets, and there's no penalty for failing to meet them. Still, this doesn't excuse the BBC from giving respectability to the arguments of people like Burns. The BBC, bollocks before climate. And that's Trex News. Exceedingly extinct. Wonder if that worked.